All right. Good evening, and thank you for taking the time to be here this evening. My name is Myla Wood, and I'm a member of Idahoans for Local Education, and we are your hosts this evening. For those of you not familiar with us, we represent taxpayers, parents, grandparents, and teachers across the state and across the whole political spectrum. Our hope by researching Idaho's documents is to open a conversation and have an honest debate about the education situation in Idaho. Each one of us has a different reason for taking an interest in Common Core, but the motivations are all the same. We love our children, we love our teachers, and we are concerned over how our tax dollars are spent. Quickly, I would like to introduce you to our founder, Stephanie Zimmerman. I don't know where she's at. In the back, most of you have seen her before. Her tireless hours of research and dedication to the truth are inspiring. And Stephanie, thanks for everything you do. You are amazing. My personal journey with Common Core came about due to the rushed implementation of the math standards in my son's class, the skipping of pre-algebra and moving straight into algebra, leaving a whole class of students feeling like they were failures. I saw my son's friends get grounded and lose privileges. This experience started me on a mission to learn more about Common Core, and I can assure you that it is not just standards. It is merely one piece of a four-part reform. Before we get too far in, I would like to ask all the elected officials to please stand up here this evening and be recognized. This is a really busy time of year for these guys, so we really appreciate any time that they give us. Do we have any teachers in the room tonight? Retired, former, yep. Thank you so much for the hard work that you do and that you have done. Thank you. While you guys are all kind of coming in, last pieces of you, I'd like to get a quick show of hands for those that feel like you're comfortable and really knowledgeable about the Common Core and the other pillars of reform. So we have a few people, all right? How many people feel like they have a lot more to learn about the Common Core and the four pillars? All right, great. I am confident that by attending tonight, you will leave here with some new information and likely have more questions that you will want answered. These four pillars of reform are a package deal. They started as four mandatory assurances that states had to agree to in order to qualify for grant money in the 2009 stimulus bill. Idaho agrees to the same four assurances, again, in our State Fiscal Stabilization Fund, our Race to the Top, and our ESCA waiver. So 4 times we agreed to these for sure. The first pillar is the new standards and tests. The second is the enhanced student-level data system, which means personal-level information. That system is cumulative birth through workforce. The third is accountability measures for teachers, schools, and districts, which does include teacher redistribution. The fourth is the turnaround of low-performing schools to be closed and reopened as privately run charters. There is a lot to learn about each of these pillars, and Dr. Luksik will use Idaho and federal documents in her presentation here tonight. She is the founder and chairman of Founded on Truth, which is a great resource for the federal documents that she uses. She has taught preschool through college. She has spent 36 years involved in evaluating curriculum, training teachers, and 4 years with the Department of Education. She is very knowledgeable about standardized testing and the SBAC. You will appreciate her depth of knowledge and her quick wit. Please give a big Idaho hand to Dr. Peg Luksik.
Thank you all for coming tonight. I guess I'll use this one. I come from Pennsylvania, so I left this morning in what would have been about 3 o'clock a.m. your time in 8 inches of snow. And the plane got out of Pennsylvania wonderfully. And we're 10 minutes into a flight to Denver, and the announcement comes over, is there a medical doctor on the plane? Someone on the plane had collapsed. and we had to go to Chicago. Thankfully, they brought the ambulance and the paramedics, and the gentleman is going to be fine. But we wound up in Chicago instead of Denver. And first they said, well, we'll only be here for 5 minutes, so we're good to go. And then they said, ha ha, we lied. And we wound up over an hour in Chicago, and so I'm on the phone to the airline saying, I'm not going to make my connection from Denver to Boise. They got me on a flight that would have gotten me here at 9 o'clock tonight and said, well, we'll put you on standby for a flight that leaves at 3 and gets here around 5. So I run to the gate in Denver where the standby flight is, and there were 22 people on standby, and I sweet talk my way to be number 1 on the list of the 22. They overbooked the flight, so there were no standbys. And the lady said, well, you can't do this. And I thought, well, there's a whole bunch of people standing here. So, I really have to be in Idaho. I have to give a speech. It starts at 6:30. If I arrive at 9, they're going to know I'm late. One of the women said, well, what are you going to talk about? And I said, I talk about Common Core. And she said, my father-in-law is a teacher in Idaho. You can have my seat. So once you're through security, you never have to show your ID again. So my name on the plane tonight was Victoria, and her name on the 7 o'clock flight is Peg. Because we just switched tickets, and the ticket agent went, just don't tell me. Because with all the weather and all the missed flights, they're just tearing their hair out in all the airports. So we owe a great thank you to Victoria for allowing me to even be here tonight. She was a very, very generous soul. You did hear my credentials. I've taught both special ed and elementary and secondary ed in pretty much all the exceptionalities in pretty much every setting that you can imagine. And I did work for the United States Department of Education. And my job for the United States Department of Education was to review and evaluate education reform initiatives. So that would be what this is. We're going to be looking at the screens tonight. Now, it didn't work. When we got here, it was broken. So we're going to be looking at side screens. And if you want to take a minute right now and just turn a chair or pull it up so that you can more comfortably look at one of these side screens, please do so. Okay, I need somebody to do it first so other people feel like they're comfortable to do it, because that's how crowds are. Are they all attached? Okay. Okay. If you can't, you can't. If you can, you can. If you need to move your seat around, if you want to sit in one of these chairs, are they allowed? Is that legal to sit in one of these chairs? So do what you need to do to see a screen. The screens are more important than, yes, you're being told yes by elected officials. The screens are more important than I am. I'm prettier. They're more important. I didn't write, well, I wrote that screen, but I didn't write the other screens you're going to see. You're going to be looking at government documents, some of them federal, some of them from your state. They're documents that your state used to either receive federal money or to get a waiver from federal regulations. And the reason that we look at those documents is the same reason that when you go to the bank for a loan and the bank says, how much money did you make? And you say $1,000 and the bank says, let me see your IRS tax return. Because you might lie to the bank, but you probably didn't lie to the IRS. Well, when your State Department of Education tells you that they're doing X, but they tell Washington in a document that they use to get money or relief from regulations that they're doing Y, they're doing Y. Because it's not a crime to lie to you. But it might be a crime to lie to the Federal Department of Education. So we're going to be looking at actual government documents so that you can see it. And what you will see is you'll see the whole document, and then if I have a pullout, I just pull out the words so you can see them. But you can actually see the document I got it from. I'm about to feed you through a fire hose, and what happens after every presentation is people say, I understood it while you said it, but then I went home and didn't remember it. So I brought for you, and they'll be in the back, they're 2 different CDs. The red one is called Should Our Children Be Standardized? And that is actually the research on what happens in classrooms when you attempt to say by government fiat that every child should learn the same thing at the same time in the same way. Can you actually standardize children? This one also includes the new Advanced Placement U.S. History College Board exam. This is the College Board exam. You may have heard about it. It teaches World War II without mentioning people like Dwight D. Eisenhower or Adolf Hitler. It also doesn't mention John Adams or Thomas Jefferson. So if you want to know what they're teaching in the new AP College History, this is the one for you. The green one is on the testing. And you hear a lot about how these tests are valid and reliable. When I was in grad school, part of my grad assistant duties was I was the person who helped to run the testing clinic in the university, where kids went for special ed testing. So I know a great deal about testing because not only did I learn it, I taught it. These tests are not valid or reliable. Those are actual definitions. And what I do is I take the actual definitions and then compare the tests to the definitions so that you can see how they don't work. So if you want to know about testing, get the green one. If you want to know about the standards, the red one. I have to pay for them, so we ask for a donation of $10 because I just circle the money around. It lets me just keep making new ones. Okay? They're in the back at the end, and you can avail yourself of that. Okay, this has a very long history. We're not going to be here all night. So we're going to start in 1989. In 1989, then President Bush the Elder held a summit meeting with the National Governors Association. The chairman at the time was a man named William Clinton. And at that meeting, they decided that they were going to break the American tradition of local control and begin to set national education goals. The legislation which President Bush the Elder was America 2000. When President Clinton was elected, it became Goals 2000. So as you can see, this is not a Republican initiative or a Democrat initiative. There are people on both sides of both political aisles for it and against it. It kind of crosses a whole different spectrum of definitions of political activity. Goals 2000 was met with an enormous outbreak of opposition across the country. It wasn't called Common Core then, it was called outcome-based education. Actually, that was the first time that I was in Idaho because I was here debating it then. Because of that, Goals 2000 didn't have any teeth. So the districts were told they had to set student standards and the states were supposed to measure up, but there was no teeth in the legislation. That was changed in 2001 with the passage of the No Child Left Behind Act. Now, there is no federal role in education, constitutionally. If you go to the United States Constitution and read it, you won't see the word education because the federal government's not supposed to be there. So how did they get around it? The federal government made money available to the states and said, do you want the money? You volunteer to take the money. But if you volunteer to take the money, you're volunteering to use all of the mandates that come with the money. That outpouring of money in a big way actually began in 1965 with a bill called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA. When the federal government makes money available, they don't make it available for the rest of time. They say this much money is available for this many years. It has a shelf life. And at the end of that many years, either the funding ends, the program ends, or the federal government reauthorizes that funding stream. ESEA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, has been reauthorized multiple times since 1965. The 2001 reauthorization of that original 1965 bill was called No Child Left Behind. It's actually a continuation of the ESEA. That's why, for example, in Idaho, in every state, when your state is attempting to get out of the requirements of No Child Left Behind, it's called an ESEA waiver, because you're trying to get out of the requirements of a reauthorization of a bill that was originally passed under President Johnson. So it's got a long history, and it's up right now for reauthorization. Actually, it expired in 2007, and they haven't been able to reauthorize it since. So they've just kind of been continuing the provisions and the funding, which has given the Department of Education great leeway in changing what the requirements are. Right now, at the federal level, the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind, and I don't know what the new name will eventually be, is being debated. So some of what I'm telling you could be different in a couple of months, depending on what the federal government decides to do. There's a huge amount of debate in Washington, so we're not expecting movement quickly because there's a lot of opposition on all sides, again, of the political aisle. What did No Child Left Behind say? It was passed in 2001, and it said that all states had to set standards. They had to set content standards and achievement standards. What's the difference? A content standard, this is what the schools will teach. An achievement standard, this is what the children will learn and demonstrate that they have learned. If I translated it to medicine, it gets a little more clear. A content standard, every doctor will prescribe every patient that walks into his office insulin. Silly. When we move it to medicine, you can hear how silly it is, but that's a content standard. An achievement standard. Everybody in this room will have a blood pressure of at least, or of no more than. Can I mandate that you all have the same blood pressure? Of course not. Why would you think then that you can mandate that every child achieve based on a government fiat? The ability to learn is as individual as your blood pressure. Be that as it may, No Child Left Behind, in fact, did make that mandate. It was placed on every public school child and school in the state, and it was in math and English language arts and eventually science. The way that the mandate worked, the standards were called rigorous. When you debate Common Core across the country, which I do, I was in Delaware on Saturday, and I'm going from here to New York, so you hear rigorous a lot. It's a marketing word. They never use another word, the proponents, and they always use the word rigorous. In marketing, it's called the law of the seventh mentioning. You have to hear it 7 times before you even know you heard it. So what the goal is that every time somebody says Common Core standards, rigorous pops in your head. We'll look tonight at how rigorous is actually defined in these standards. The way that the achievement was measured, the states had to put together achievement tests, and they had to say that there were levels of achievement. Advanced was what you think. Proficient is passing. Generally, you would probably think of that as a B, although we're going to look at what it really is in the state. And then there was a third level achievement below that called basic, which would be a C-. Every year, the state had to show that they were making progress toward getting every child up to those standards. And not only did they have to make progress toward every child meeting the standards, they had to say that the achievement gap, that the bottom children were moving up. So the number of kids at the bottom had to get less. And the states were actually given benchmarks, saying you have to meet this target. This many kids have to get above this line. And every year they had to get closer. And No Child Left Behind said that it was the school year that ended in 2013, 2014, every state had to prove that 100% of the children were proficient in math and reading. Well, that's a structural impossibility. The way it happened was with the assessments, the annual yearly assessments. So the states were given a mandate, and they were told, you have to get to 100% proficiency, but you can define proficient however you want. So what happened? Well, let me show you. Stand up. Wiggle while you're up. Exercise. Good. Very good. Okay, this is vocal performance. When you can meet my standard, you can sit down, but you cannot sit down until you meet my standard. Are you ready? Anybody who can sing like Pavarotti, considered one of the greatest tenors of the 20th century, can sit down. Soloist with the New York Metropolitan Opera. I actually had a person sit down at that one time. Chorus member with the New York Met. Soloist with the Regional Symphony. Chorus member with the Regional Symphony. Congratulations, we had someone sit down. Soloist with the church choir. Sings in the church choir. Sings in the shower and enjoys it. Can't carry a tune in a bucket. Can't find the bucket. Now remember, in this system, all the states had to show that 100% of the children were proficient. And there were penalties if you didn't reach it. But you could define proficient wherever you wanted. Where would we define proficient in vocal performance? Well, where did you all sit down? At Sings in the Shower and Enjoys It. I am a teacher in a classroom. In this system, there is no reward to me whatsoever for one child taking one step beyond that minimum standard. But there are draconian penalties if every child doesn't meet the standard. So what happens? Well, the National Research Council has actually done research on that, and what they said was that they've looked in Chicago and Texas and New York, which are huge population bases. The teacher focus moves to the children immediately above the standard, so they don't drop below, and the children immediately below the standard. So I would be focusing on the people who can sing in the shower and enjoy it, and the people who can't carry a tune in a bucket. What about the gentleman here who sat down at the Regional Symphony level? Well, see, when he walked into the classroom, he could already sing in the shower and enjoy it. So he met the standard. So I didn't need to do anything with him. Did education succeed for him, or did it fail? It failed. But it's a silent failure because he passed the test. And in fact, the University of Connecticut said that in this system, the kids at the top feel there's a ceiling on instruction. They feel tremendously pressured to take the test and do well because they're carrying the burden for meeting these artificial standards, but they feel like they're completely lost and overlooked. Who else is overlooked? The kids at the very bottom. Our Mr. and Mrs. can't find the bucket back there because the teacher cuts her losses. She gets everybody as close as she can to that minimum standard. And in fact, achievement gaps are growing. They're not shrinking because the kids at the bottom get lost. The other thing they found is that the curriculum narrows to the test. Now, is this new information? In fact, it's not. In 1983, President Reagan actually commissioned a study on education. The report was called A Nation at Risk. It was a very famous report issued by the U.S. Department of Education. And what that said, among other things in the very large report, was this whole minimum competency movement is a mistake. Because the report said the minimum will become the maximum, and education for everyone will go down. Well, what did you do here in Idaho? So what I did was, I actually went to your state, and I pulled, this is right off of your website, your state report card. This is grade 4 reading, and I looked at all students. So if I add proficient or higher, which is advanced and proficient, and this is in 2013, I get 90% of the kids scored advanced or proficient in the Iowa state test. Now, the U.S. Department of Education has a national assessment of education, and Idaho participates in the national assessment. So in 2013, when the same 4th graders took a reading test on what should be the same material, wouldn't you expect them to have the same pass rate? But they did not. Your state test in that year said 90% of the children passed the state test, but those same children taking, that should say grade 4 reading, only 33% of them passed. And in fact, if you look at the chart on the wall, there's a line in the middle. Everything on the right-hand side of the line is proficient or above, and you see it really hasn't significantly changed. So you adopted Common Core. Your Race to the Top grant was 2010. This is 2013. Kids aren't passing. The state test results show wonderful, wonderful progress. But when those same children take a national assessment, which is not tied to Idaho at all, the national assessment, they don't care if you pass or fail, they just give the test. Only 33% of them pass. Well, let's move to 8th grade. In 8th grade, in your reading test, 94% were proficient or higher. When those same children, same 8th graders, took the national assessment, 39%. That's a huge difference. In Idaho, you actually assess in high school. So in grade 10, your reading assessment said 89% of them were passing. Now, the national assessment is not given in 10th grade. It's given in 12th grade. So it is not an exact comparison, but at least it gives you an idea of how your high school kids are doing when they get to the final year, and 41% are passing. So when they get to the national assessment, less than half the kids are passing. In some cases, only about a third of your kids are passing. Is math any better? Grade 4 math, 86%. When they take the national assessment, same 4th graders, 39%. 8th grade, your state test, 80%. National assessment, 33% pass. 10th grade, 77%. National assessment is given in 12th grade, only 24% passed. But I went back and looked at what does the test, because there's a big difference between 10th grade math and 12th grade math. So if the 12th grade assessment included calculus, trig, pre-calc functions, there could be maybe you saw a drop in those last 2 years. But in fact, the national assessment does not test those things. There are 5 mathematics content areas that are tested: number, properties, and operations, measurement, geometry, data analysis, statistics, probability, and algebra. They are tested at all the levels. They do not add extra topics. They just test the same topics at higher levels. So a 77% pass rate to a 24% pass rate is a problem. So then I went back to say, well, how does the national assessment get their results? Where did those results come from? The national assessment is a nationally normed test. The achievement levels in math were actually set in 1992 and haven't been changed. The achievement levels in reading were set in 92 and then validated in 94. They both use a method that comes from a doctor who wrote a book in the 1970s on how you measure educational achievement, and it was used because employers were doing it and needed their test to stand up in court. And one of the things that this measurement system says is you don't measure on students, because there's so much room for invalidity and unreliability when you do use children. So the national assessment standards have not been changed. They've been around since the 1990s. They're pretty standard. They mean the same thing. The criterion hasn't changed. If this is what it is to pass, this is what it is to pass. And that hasn't changed at all. This is what you use in Idaho. The advanced level demonstrates a thorough understanding of grade level skills, and the proficient level demonstrates a satisfactory understanding. What is the difference between those two words? And if your children are all submitting tests and there are thousands of people reading and scoring those tests on a scaled score of several hundred points, which they are, how do you know that the person scoring your child's test interpreted thorough the same way that the person sitting beside them did? You know, I, in several years, used to be a forensics judge, you know, the local regional forensics, the schools all come together and they have teams and then people have to come in to judge them. So I was one of the judges. There were 2 judges in each of the rooms, and it was a 1 through 7 point scale. So I judged junior high in most of the years that I did it. And when the kids would come in, I don't know if you've ever heard junior high kids make a speech, but they make a speech and they begin the sentence and then they end at the end. And then they start the next sentence, but then they lose the rest of the sentence. And then they begin again, but then they lose the rest of the sentence. And so I would grade down for that because that's not really how you're supposed to make a speech. And some junior high children, when they make a speech, you've seen them. And then Sally went to, and you're almost seasick by the end because they're nervous and they're rocking. So I would grade down for that, and then I would give the children, in my critique, here's what you did, and here are specific suggestions to do better the next time. So it was an actual critique with positive feedback. How do you do better? And in one of the sessions, I looked at the lady sitting beside me, and she gave everybody a 7 in everything. And I looked at her and said, you know, it's a competition, right? And she said, but I want them all to feel good. Okay. How do you know whether the person scoring your child's exam interprets thorough the way that I interpreted 7 points, or whether the person interprets thorough the way that other judge did? You don't know. In fact, in Pennsylvania, I just got a letter from a woman, same system you use here in Idaho, and her child didn't pass by 4 points out of 200 because he was satisfactory instead of thorough. That is not valid or reliable, but that's how your things are being scored. And promotion and graduation are relying on this kind of a system. Additionally, and I did the same thing with math, because in math, it's not just math. In math, you have what are called constructive response assessments, which is where the child gets a math problem and they solve the problem, but then they have to write about, tell me why you did what you did, give me some reasoning, explain your work. Now, if you ask a little girl to write an essay about why she did what she did, she's going to fill up 2 pieces of paper. She might begin by telling you what she had for breakfast that morning, because that's how little girls are. I have 6 children. They are all girls, except for 5 of them. It's an IQ joke. 3 of my boys are engineers. If you asked any of my engineering sons, why did you do the math the way that you did it, they would say, because that's the way it worked. And what they would think but not say is, you dummy. What are you asking me this for? It's how it works. So boys, on average, will get a lower score. English language learners will get a lower score, not because they did the math wrong, but because they wrote about it not as well. Learning disabled children will get a lower score. Learning disabilities are funny things. Sometimes they're across the board, but often the disability surfaces either in numerics or in language. So a child who has no disability in numerics, but now is in a test that's called math, in which they have to write, his language disability is going to mask his mathematical achievement level, which means he's going to get a lower math score. But we weren't scoring math. And children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds who maybe don't communicate as well in standard English, who can do the math, but don't write about it as well, who will also get a lower math score in a test that in fact is not math. Your state in 2007 changed your cut scores. Remember, we looked at the NAEP. Those scores have been consistent since 1992. They were validated. They tell you where they got them. Your state board in 2007 just changed the cut scores, which means that proficient in 2006 didn't mean the same as it meant in 2007. Cut score means, what does it mean to pass? That's a moving target. If you can't compare over time, it makes that score meaningless. So if you are a teacher and your evaluation is tied to this, how is that possibly fair? If you're a legislator and you're attempting to set objective public policy, you're getting subjective data. In your Race to the Top grant application, your state talked about that and said, Idaho began using standards-based testing in the fall of 2002, expanded it to more grades, and in 2004, only 75% of the students were proficient in grade 4, but by 2009, 83% were proficient. Right, because in the middle, you changed the cut score. The children's achievement didn't necessarily change. What changed was the definition of passing. And once that can change, it can go up or down. In New York, when they began the new Common Core test, before one single test was developed or administered, the New York Commissioner of Education predicted that instead of 67% pass rates on average, which they had before, that only 37% of the children will pass. That was kind of a weird number, 37%. And as if by magic, because they set the cut scores after the tests were given, and they already knew how the students performed. And there were actually newspaper articles written about it, which meant they weren't measuring the students against the standards. They were measuring the standard against the student and manipulating the standard. Well, once the State Department of Education can manipulate the standard, that standard becomes meaningless for you. People say, what would you do as an alternative? And one of the things that should be first on everybody's list is don't let the Department of Education evaluate itself. You know, if you were a business and if you were a bank, and a business came and said, I want a loan, and you said, how are you doing? And the business said, well, I've set standards for myself, and then I designed a test to see how well I was meeting them, and then I administered the test, and then I scored the test, but I didn't show you what passing was, and then I reported on how well I did, and I did great. Would your bank give that business a loan? Of course not. But in this system, the federal government told the states, you have to move to 100% proficiency, which is impossible. So we put the states in an insane place and said there are penalties if you don't meet it. But you can define proficient wherever you want. Well, if we went to the medical community and told all the doctors that all of your patients had to have the same blood pressure, and if they don't, you're going to lose your job as a doctor, but you could set blood pressure wherever you want, where would they put it? At 340 over 280? Because then everybody would meet it. That's basically what we did to departments of education. And then the poor teacher in the classroom is the one stuck in the middle, attempting to make something intelligent out of this. And if you're in any way a policymaker, I bet you didn't know they changed the cut scores. And I bet you don't know what they were before, and you don't know what they really are now. Because a cut score that says it's 200, that doesn't tell you anything. Is that 60%? Is that 30%? Is that 90%? In Pennsylvania, I went back and looked at the cut scores to pass our Algebra 1 test. If you got a 33%, you got told you were proficient in one of our models. At no point did you have to get better than a 60. In Maryland, they set the cut scores, and it's on their website. We put the cut scores at the place where every child would pass. And my kids went, Mom, come and go to school in Maryland. So the scores are meaningless. You can't make decisions off of them because they're an internal audit and the target keeps moving. And when you move it away from that to the national assessment, in fact, the kids aren't doing so well. They're not passing. And those numbers haven't moved at all. You began, and I just took what we just talked about and made it bigger, so you can kind of look at the numbers a little better. In 2003, 2004, 44% were proficient. Now 74% are proficient. Yeah, because you moved the cut score. If you see a 30% jump in achievement in that short of a time, statewide, a reasonable person would go, I don't think so. It's not just Idaho. This is a chart from the National Center for Education Statistics. It's from 2008. And what the National Center did was it compared the national assessment achievement levels to every state. So the brown bar at the top is the achievement level that you would have to be declared proficient in the NAEP. The middle dark blue bar is basic. Remember, that was a C- or so in the NAEP. And everything below that means you flunked the NAEP. The little red flags are the level of achievement that each state in this country determined that you would need to have to be proficient. Not one single state put proficient at the same place that the NAEP did. Only 8 states defined proficient at the achievement level that the NAEP would call basic, and fully 42 states defined their level of proficiency in an achievement place that the NAEP would call failure. In fact, by 2010, the National Center for Public Policy and Higher Education reported that nearly 60% of our kids going into college needed remediation. Well, of course they did. Of course they did. Now, we could have gone back and said, okay, we've had, by 2010, No Child Left Behind had been in effect for 8 full school years. So you had 2 full cohorts of high school kids come through it. We could have gone back and said, should we have the federal government mandating achievement? Maybe we need to talk about the idea that we can standardize education. Maybe we need to go back and actually talk to teachers about, is this working or is this not working? But that's not what happened. In 2008, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation got involved. This is a $2.2 million grant right off of their website that they gave to the James B. Hahn Institute. And the grant was given to promote the adoption of rigorous, there's that word again, internationally benchmarked education standards by the states. Now, the year that they got that $2.2 million, their total income was $2.5 million. So they were very open to what the Gates Foundation had to say. The first thing that they did was they did a newsletter saying that they were partnering with groups like Achieve and the Alliance for Excellence of Education to develop the potential for a common core, and here's where the word first surfaces, of these education standards. The Gates Foundation continued to give money to the Hahn Institute to implement this, and the next grant was in 2009. It was $5.5 million to help states rapidly implement the Common Core. When parents have been getting involved in this issue, it's like a done deal. And then they go to their state representatives and their state senators who go, we didn't know anything about this. Well, those elected officials aren't lying. They didn't. They were not involved in the process. In fact, the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund specifically told the governors and the departments not to go to the legislature and to move as quickly as possible in spending the money. Because now when you talk about it, what comes back to you too often is, well, we've already spent all the money. We've spent all this money. We can't stop now. Well, the goal was to spend the money quickly. Now, if you think about it, that's a ridiculous argument. Merck put a drug called Vioxx on the market. They spent billions of dollars in its development and implementation, and then it was found to have terrible side effects. And so there was a big push to get it off the market. Merck was actually not allowed to say, but we spent all this money. No, they had to pull the drug off the market. So it's not really an excuse, but it is one that's used. And from the beginning, the goal was to move as rapidly as possible. So the Hahn Institute did a second newsletter and said a growing number of organizations have expressed support for these Common Core standards. And then they list all of the organizations that have expressed support for the standards. And of course, then the Hahn Institute is going to respond to that expression of support. So I looked all of those organizations up to see if any of them got money from the Gates Foundation. 25 million, 10 million, 11 million, 37 million, 24 million, 11 million, 4 million, 4 million, and 11 million. The only group that didn't receive money in that time period was the secondary school principals because their bylaws don't allow it. That's a lot of money. So the Hahn Institute, using funding from the Gates Foundation, said, we need the Common Core standards. And all these groups are calling for the Common Core standards. All of them got money from the Gates Foundation. And then the Hahn Institute got more money from the Gates Foundation to respond to the Gates Foundation-funded call for the Common Core standards. It was a marketing circle, and the Gates Foundation was on every single piece of it. Interestingly, Bill Gates was recently, well, this is from 2013, he actually spoke at Harvard, and this is from the Washington Post, and he said, well, we won't know if this will work for about a decade. And his children go to a school that does not do Common Core. So the question is, why? This is from the Daily Caller. No great American philanthropist ever got to be an American philanthropist without first becoming an American business tycoon. The Washington Post has reported that Mr. Gates' company is going to make a ton of cash from the implementation of Common Core in public school classrooms. They've used over $2 million, actually it's over $250 million. But their webpage in April of 2014 had a notice called Tech Essentials for Testing Success, and schools will need to use Microsoft products. And a report issued by Smarter Balanced, only 56% of the schools were they were running on old Windows, so they're all going to need to upgrade their software, their monitors, their headphones, and the report actually included at the bottom you can see that Macs are just not supported by this process. In the Hunt newsletter, they said they were partnering with Achieve. Achieve received about $24 million from the Gates Foundation. We saw it on an earlier slide. And they said they were going to transform this concept of college and career readiness from a radical proposal into a national agenda, and they were doing it at the direction of 48 states. No, they weren't. No state legislatures have passed legislation authorizing Achieve to write standards that would be mandatory for all the children of that state. No state legislature appropriated a single penny to Achieve. In fact, Achieve went to the states and said, if you want federal money, you have to sign a memorandum of understanding in order to, and with us, saying you're going to implement the standards, and you have to attach that to your Race to the Top grant application. They marketed it to the states. It didn't come from the states. While the standards are being written, people began to say, well, who's writing them? So this is actually from the National Governors Association press release in July of 2009. And they said they gave the names of the development work group. There were 29 of them. They were content experts from Achieve, ACT, and the College Board. Did you see classroom teachers? Neither did I. None of those 29 people were classroom teachers. None of those 29 people were freshman-level college professors of English or math, which you would think would be reasonable if you want to know how do you get ready for college-level English. Wouldn't you ask somebody who teaches it? But they did not. The work group's deliberations were confidential. We don't know who picked the members of the work group. We don't know why they were selected. We have no minutes of their meetings. We don't know who wrote what. We don't know what they looked at, what they considered, or why they chose the standards that they chose. Everything was and remains confidential. Additionally, the press release said that there would be feedback groups. And when you debate this, what you get are lists of all these. See, all these teachers were involved. They sat on the feedback groups. The feedback groups were allowed to ask questions, make suggestions, but as the press release said, the feedback group was advisory, not decision-making. You know, when my 6 kids were little, many nights they would ask for a treat before they went to bed. I could always say no. I didn't have to give a reason, and my decision was final. The feedback groups were the children, and the work groups were the parents. Finally, there was a validation committee that was supposed to have content experts. They didn't all sign. Some of the non-signers have not gone public. Their names were removed from the document. Two members of the validation committee have gone very public. One is a former Stanford math professor. He taught for more than 40 years. His name is James Milgram. And one is an English language arts professor who actually was involved in writing the Massachusetts standards and sat on the Massachusetts State Board. They both sat on the validation committee, and they both refused to sign off on the standards. So the response was not to include their comments or their questions with a minority report. If you read the final report, it's like they're just not there. So it looks like it's unanimous, except it's not. This is actually the Common Core website, and the standards are copyrighted. They're owned by two private organizations, the National Governors Association Center for Best Practices and the Council of Chief State School Officers. They're both private nonprofits. They're headquartered in Washington, D.C., and they are the sole owners and developers of the standards, which means you can't change them because they're copyrighted. I testified in Tennessee, and one of the members of the Tennessee Senate Education Committee asked one of the folks involved, well, what if we don't like these standards? Can we get rid of them? Can we rewrite them? Can we delete the ones we don't like? And the fellow said, well, you can add up to 15%. And the senator said, so the answer is no. And the guy went, well, yeah, the answer is no. They're copyrighted. You can't change them. If you ever bought a car, well, you can go to a dealer. You could buy a brand new car, with that bumper-to-bumper 100,000-mile warranty. Maybe you can't afford that. So you buy a gently used car, like last year's model, that has the balance of the manufacturer's warranty, but is cheaper. Maybe you can't afford that. So you go to a dealer and you buy a high-end dealer used car with the dealer's warranty, 90 days, 60 days, transmission. Or you buy the oldest, most dilapidated car on the lot. The one that as soon as you sign the paper, the dealer's responsibility ends and it says the words, as is, in the label. The Common Core website says that the Common Core state standards are provided as is, just like the label on the oldest, most dilapidated cars. The website goes on to say that under no circumstances shall the owners of the standards be held liable for anything that happens because of their use, and anyone who uses them waives their right to seek legal redress. They don't stand behind these standards the way that Sears stands behind a power saw. Did anybody notice? This is from the Washington Post. It was an article written by two early childhood educators, and they said the people involved in writing the early childhood K through 3 standards, they didn't have none of them was an early childhood professional. When the draft standards were made available, Stephanie Feeney, she's from the University of Hawaii, said the people who wrote these standards don't appear to have any background at all in early childhood development. The Common Core standards don't provide for research. When something is research-based, it looks like this. I do it, I give it to you and you and you and you, and I say, could you test these for me? Now, I'm going to get back to you. Did you like them? Did you hate them? What was good? What was bad? And then I'm going to change them. Research, I'm actually going to research them. But remember, these were offered as is. They were written in secret and plunked in the marketplace. By definition, they're not research-based. The article said that the Common Core website that said they received 10,000 comments. They published 24 out of 10,000. They don't mention a statement that they received that was signed by more than 500 early childhood educators, psychologists, child development specialists, pediatricians, opposing the standards. The statement said that the signers had grave concerns about the core standards for young children. The proposed standards conflict with compelling new research in cognitive science, in neuroscience, in child development, and in early childhood education about how young children learn, about what they need to learn, and how to teach them in kindergarten and the early grades. Among the 500-plus signers were the 3 past presidents of the National Association for the Education of Young Children, which is considered the foremost authority on early childhood education in America. 11 copies of that statement were hand-delivered to the writers of the Common Core state standards, and they were summarily ignored. And when the standards were finally put out, Dr. Carla Horowitz from the Yale Child Study Center said, many of the most experienced and gifted teachers are just quitting because the standards will cause suffering, not learning, for young children. Were her claims true? This is testimony given in the state of New York by Mary Calamia. It was given in October of 2013. Mrs. Calamia is a licensed clinical social worker in New York State, and she's been providing psychotherapy services since 1995. She said, in the fall of 2012, I started to receive an inordinate number of student referrals. I was being referred to a large number of honors students, mostly 8th graders. The kids were self-mutilating, cutting themselves with sharp objects, and burning themselves with cigarettes. My phone never stopped ringing. I also started to receive more calls referring early elementary school students who were refusing to go to school. They said they felt stupid and school was too hard. They were throwing tantrums, begging to stay home, and upset even to the point of vomiting. Everyone was talking about the tests. As the school year progressed and the tests loomed, my patients began to report increased self-mutilating behaviors, insomnia, panic attacks, loss of appetite, depressed mood, and in one case, suicidal thoughts that resulted in a 2-week hospital stay for an adolescent. She went on to say, these are inappropriate. She said, we cannot regulate biology. Young children are simply not wired to engage in the type of critical thinking that the Common Core calls for. That will require a fully developed prefrontal cortex, a part of the brain that's not fully functional until early adulthood. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for critical thinking and rational decision-making and abstract thinking, all things the Common Core demands prematurely. We teach children to succeed, and then we give them pre-assessments on material they have never seen and tell them it's okay to fail. Children aren't equipped to resolve that mixed message. We ask children to write critically, using emotionally charged language to persuade rather than inform. Lacking a functional prefrontal cortex, a child taps into their limbic system, which is a set of primitive brain functions involved in basic human emotions, fear and anger being foremost. So when we're asking young children to use emotionally charged language, we're actually asking them to fuel their persuasiveness with fear and anger. They're not capable of the judgment required to temper this with reason and logic. The standards are developmentally inappropriate because they're developmentally inappropriate. Unfortunately, small children in that situation are unable to evaluate the standards. So when they can't do it, the only thing they know how to do is say, I'm stupid. And there are cases all over the country of little ones saying that. I've been in audiences with early childhood teachers who are literally in tears, saying, I can't do this anymore. What you hear is, and this is kind of hilarious, well, we used to just teach them facts, and we didn't teach them anything else, and they never understood why they borrowed or carried or whatever. Well, first of all, that's ridiculous. Do you know why you borrow and carry? Where do you think you learned it? In those early grades. There's a reason that we taught concrete things to small children. First of all, their brains are concrete. They can't do abstract thinking. Second of all, what do little kids want to be most? Big. How do they know they're big? They know stuff. So when we taught them math facts, when we taught them 5 and 9 is 14, and 5 times 9 is 45, they could do it. They understood it. They felt good about themselves. And we taught it to them not to develop fluency, which is a meaningless word, but to develop what was called automaticity. If I said to each of you, what time is it? You would glance at your watch. I'm watching people do it. And without losing your train of thought at all, a time pops into your head. You did 7 things. I know. I've taught kids how to tell time. The first time I did it, it was like, this is really hard. I didn't realize it was so complicated. But it's automatic. Well, we taught those math facts to make them automatic so that when they were doing a calculus problem and they came upon 7 times 8, they didn't have to write 7 rows of 8 sticks and count them. They didn't even have to think about it. The number popped into their head without them having to lose their train of thought. We taught concrete things to concrete thinkers. They could succeed, and they did. And then as they developed, we added abstract as their minds could manage it. Now, does that mean we never taught them why to borrow or carry? You probably haven't thought of this in years. But think back to when you were in 2nd grade, when you first learned to carry. You got little squares, and then you got little sticks, And then you got little blocks. And the little sticks had 10 divisions on them. And the problem was 17 plus 5. And the teacher said, okay, put this, you have how many squares for 7? Put 7. And that's a 10, put a stick. And 15, a stick, and 5 squares. Okay, now, here's, when you get to 10, so you can fill up this little stick. So 7 and 5, we count them out, that's 12. Oh, look, we can fill a stick. So the little ones would take, and you did this, they took each little block and put it on the little stick, and then you picked up the stick and you carried it over to the tens column, and you put it down. And how many little blocks were left? 2. So that's what's left. But now I have how many sticks? You actually physically carried it. And then the textbook, you no longer had the sticks, but the textbook had a picture with the little block and the little sticks and the big block with each column. And so you moved, and I'm watching all these heads go, yeah, I did that. Yes, you did. You did. We taught it concretely because you were a concrete thinker. Now we say to these kids, tell us why 2 and 2 is 4. Do you know why 2 and 2 is 4? I bet you don't. There's actually reasons, but no 6-year-old knows. But see, when you ask an adult and they can't do it, we giggle. It's like, that was a stupid question, who cares? But when you ask a 6-year-old and the teacher's in the classroom and you have to write it on the test, and they can't, no wonder they don't want to go to school. No wonder they're vomiting. And the smaller the child, the fewer defenses they have to fight back. Your state is a member of the Smarter Balanced Assessment System. There are actually 2 consortium that you could pick from to join. One was called PARC. It seems like most of the states in the East went to PARC and most of the states in the West went to Smarter Balance. There are a few exceptions, but it kind of seems like that. Smarter Balance is an assessment system. It uses online adaptive tests. What does that mean? It means that the test changes while you're taking it. That means you might not take the same test as she does, even though you're sitting beside each other in the same classroom. So how does anybody make a decision about how well the children are doing if they're all taking a different test? I can make the test easier, and I can make the test harder. From a decision-making standpoint, that means you have no information at all. It also means the test can be easily manipulated. I can make a teacher look like she's doing really well or really poorly. I can make a state look like that or a school district look like that. Will somebody do that? I have no idea. Does the capacity exist? Yes, it does. It says it will use item design and open-ended items. That's constructive response. We're back to thorough understanding or satisfactory understanding, not valid or reliable. You know, it sounds really abstract until you think about there's real-world implications. Have you ever watched the Olympics? We've all watched the Olympics, right? You ever watched the figure skating? 9 judges watch the same person do the same performance at the same time and give it 9 different scores. And those judges are all experts in their fields. How can this be valid and reliable? The proposal writing is governed. The assessment system is governed by the states. It will include teachers, schools, school administrators, state departments of education. All the states will report student, school, district, and state results based on a single common set of rigorous achievement standards. So 1 set of standards, 1 test. What you hear when you debate this across the country, and I've heard this a million times, PEG. These are just standards. This isn't curriculum. That's educational poppycock. Education that doesn't have standards, doesn't have curriculum attached, aren't worth the paper that they're written on. And if I control the test, I control everything. Look at it this way. The standard is you have to make a chocolate cake that tastes just like my chocolate cake and has the same texture as my chocolate cake. See my cake? It's a wonderful cake. 3 layers, sprinkles, to die for. And the assessment is I'm coming to taste your cake. How many recipes can there be? 1. Because if you change anything, you won't pass the assessment because the cake won't taste the same. If somebody outside your state is controlling the assessment and somebody outside your state is controlling the standards, and those assessments are high stakes, which they are, promotion, graduation, teacher evaluation is tied to them, your state no longer controls your curriculum. Because if you don't teach that curriculum, you won't pass that test. You signed the memorandum here. You signed it in January of 2010 was when you joined the Smarter Balance Consortium, and those are the signatures of the folks who did it. Smarter Balance signed an agreement with the United States Department of Education. So they're a federally funded entity, and we'll look at the amount of money they got in a minute, which is raising some constitutional questions because, you know, the federal government is really not supposed to be controlling curriculum. And people in Congress are beginning to figure out if they control the tests, they control the curriculum. So there are now some constitutional issues being raised about this. The purpose of the agreement that Smarter Balance signed with the feds is to support new common assessment systems that are valid, reliable, and fair. Well, we've already talked about that. In math and English language arts. They're based on a common set of college and career-ready standards. You know, we use that word a lot, college and career-ready. What does that mean? Let me tell you about my 6 children. My oldest is an architect. My second one, who's my daughter, is a classical ballerina. She's a principal dancer. She's been a professional dancer since she's been 17. My third son is a Navy nuke. He runs the nuclear reactors on one of our fast attack submarines he's stationed in Pearl Harbor. My next son is an opera singer. My next son is an engineer who has just informed me he's going to become a priest. And my last son is still in college in mechanical engineering. So if one set of standards is going to make those 6 children college and career ready, those standards would have to simultaneously say that they made sure that at the end of high school, every single child is ready for the ability to design buildings, dance professionally, run a nuclear reactor, sing at the operatic level, become an engineer, and join a seminary. Really? Does such a set of standards exist? No. College and career ready is a slogan. You know the company We Are Farmers? The insurance company? Is that out here? We Are Farmers? They do commercials. We are farmers, and everybody goes bump it up, bump, 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 bump. Does bump it up, bump, 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 bump mean anything? No, it just sounds good because it makes you remember we are farmers. College and career ready is the bump it up, bump, 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 bump of this system. It doesn't actually mean anything. Because there is no way you can have one set of standards to prepare every child for the myriad of careers that exist out there. It's just not possible. It's gibberish. According to Smarter Balanced agreement with the federal government, they would develop the assessment system against this common set of standards. They would elicit all of the student responses. They would score it. The agreement says that you, the state, will develop the Smarter Balanced, and then working with you, would develop a strategy to make student-level data that results from this assessment system available on an ongoing basis for research. I bet you didn't know that. So the information that is collected in these online adaptive tests has to be made available to the federal government at a student level, and it's in the contract. Smarter Balance received $159, almost $160 million originally from the federal government, and then that was supplemented with an additional $16 million in order to develop the assessments. Smarter Balanced, and therefore the state, had to provide access to all the data collected to the state level. So your state can't keep any data separate. They had to work with the department to develop a strategy to make student-level data available for research. Now, there's a federal law. It's called the Federal Education Rights and Privacy Act. The Obama administration reinterpreted the regulations around that law to say that anyone with a legitimate educational interest can now have access to the data. How do I know someone has a legitimate educational interest? They fill out a form and tell the government that they do. And it includes vendors and researchers. Smarter Balance, in its assessment, which you've heard is so rigorous, beginning in 6th grade, the kids can use a calculator when they take the math test. There's also what they call universal tools, and I know this is, I'm sorry because it's on the side so it's hard to read. Universal tools are tools that every child taking the test is allowed to use. So there's an online calculator for them. There's Spellcheck, and the way that it works, according to the documents, is if your child is typing and they spell the word incorrectly, just like on your computer, the little red line comes up and says, "Oh, honey, you spelled it wrong." Doesn't sound rigorous to me. They have a glossary online, and they can highlight the words in all of the selections, and the glossary will tell them what the word means. So if they can't actually read on grade level, we'll just tell them. These are the meaning of the words. They have a zoom tool. They can highlight things. Not an assessment. The federal government's role began, as you heard, with the stimulus bill, and inside of it was a $53.6 billion appropriation to the Department of Education called the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund. Race to the Top was a little bit of that $53.6 billion. It was only $4.35 billion, and you had to do the stabilization fund before you could even apply for Race to the Top. In order to get it, and you heard about the assurances, we're only going to talk about 2 of them tonight, you had to move toward the standards and you had to establish a data system. Your state got $245 million in stabilization money. You applied for Race to the Top in January of 2010, and in your Race to the Top application, you agreed to adopt the Common Core standards, which were not made publicly available until June of 2010. So in January, your state promised to tie every single child in the state to standards that no one had yet seen. Your state also applied for flexibility. Remember, it says ESEA, that's actually No Child Left Behind. So you did all 3 things. You got the stabilization money, you reached for Race to the Top, and you tried to get out of the waiver. Now, the Race to the Top application, which we're going to look at here again, is a little odd. When I worked for the department, I used to read hundreds of these things. They all look the same because it's easier to read them. Generally, the signing statement says, "To the best of my knowledge and belief, everything in this is true," just like your IRS tax return. But the Race to the Top grant application had an additional line. "I further certify that I have read the application, I am fully committed to it, and I will support its implementation." Generally, when one is applying to the federal government for money, it's if I get the money, I'll do this. But if I don't get the money, I'm not going to do this. But in Race to the Top, your governor and your education officials had to promise they would do it without conditions. That is highly unusual, meaning if you got the money or not, and you didn't. You didn't get Race to the Top money. You applied at phase 1, and you didn't get it. Only 2 states got it, Delaware and Tennessee, and you didn't do it after that. But it didn't matter because you already promised that you would implement because the application required it of you. In all of them, the federal government, these are the assurances pages. When the federal government really wants you to do something, they make the states sign the same language. So you don't get airy-fairy sort of kind of a promise. All the language is the same. So the federal government required the state to say that they would establish a longitudinal data system and that it would have all the elements of a federal legislation called the America Competes Act. The feds actually held training seminars on how to implement. This is right from their seminars. And what they said was that the SLDS, State Longitudinal Data System, you had to be able to connect early childhood, post-secondary, and labor data. You had to be able to connect teachers and students. You had to provide access to the research community. And the data had to be able to cross state lines. Now, I don't know how much any of you know about computer programming. But the only way that data can cross lines is if everybody uses the same codes. All of the data systems are coded. So attendance is number, I'm making a number up, 00069. If attendance is going to cross state lines, it means every state has to code attendance 00069. Because if it's not coded the same, it can't cross. So there's really only one system, and all the states use it. The elements included enrollment information, transcript information, which sounds innocuous until you think about all the things you tell your school when you enroll the child and all the things that are included in your transcript. Birth, who they live with, what's in your family, perhaps your religion. If there's a school lunch program, you might give them your IRS tax returns, vaccination records, health records, disciplinary records. Last year in Pennsylvania, a 7-year-old was eating a Pop-Tart, and he took 2 bites and said to the teacher, "Look, it looks like a mountain." And she said, "I think it looks like a gun." And he was suspended because it was a very dangerous Pop-Tart. But his permanent school record says he was suspended for making terroristic threats. He was 7. But that's in the data system because disciplinary records are part of your transcript. It was called a P through 20 system. The little box, K through 12. The middle box included post-secondary early education. The big box, which is where the stimulus money came from, there's your labor data, your financial records, and your health records. Tennessee actually calls it a 360-degree view of the child. In Idaho, you began implementing and receiving grants from the state. This was one to add post-secondary and workforce data. You wanted to incorporate workforce data into your P through 20 system. You said that your state developed the grant initially with $5.9 million, and then you got an additional $2.5 million of state money. But now you want to implement, here in 2010, you're going to move it into including labor data into the data system. And this continues to talk about how you're moving into, you're going to have a longitudinal workforce database. So all the Department of Education data moves into workforce data, so it follows forever. You went on to say that the workforce data would create the P through 20 system, and the Department of Education agreed to exchange confidential information with Idaho's Department of Labor. The long document at the bottom, it says application number at the bottom. That's what you sent to the Federal National Center for Education Statistics, and you got the grant to do this. So this is right out of the application and then the contract. The system was using first name, middle name, last name, gender, date of birth, and if there's a social security number, that will be included as well. Research data can also be requested. It says originally they can get student level de-identified data for research purposes. However, if they need, it doesn't preclude re-identification of the data. So if they actually need to be able to find the child, that will be made available as well. You're developing a plan to make this larger so that while the Department of Education collects the data, it eventually will reside in the Department of Labor. You have partnerships with additional state agencies. Specifically mentioned was the Department of Transportation because of all the information that's included with your driver's license. This is actually the Federal Data Quality Campaign, and they go through and look at every state to see how they're doing at all of those essential elements we're talking about. And by 2011, Idaho had all 10. The yellow states have all 10. So Idaho has all of the essential elements that we're talking about. They told the federal government, you've got them all in your database. At the federal level, and I found this at the United States Department of Labor, it's called the Workforce Data Quality Initiative. And it supports the development of or enhancements to databases that will integrate workforce data and create linkages to education data. The state is to use their longitudinal system to follow individuals through school, into and through their work life. So this is a womb to tomb data system. The federal government's database says that the workforce data will be matched with education data, individual level information beginning with pre-kindergarten through post-secondary schooling all the way through entry and sustained participation in the workforce and employment services. And from that same website, Idaho received a grant for $1 million to participate in this project. Now that's the bad news. The interesting news is an article surfaced in January of this year saying that your longitudinal data system went from cradle to cadaver because they can't get it to work. The article went on to say that the system that was developed, it's instead a hodgepodge. You've spent $42 million, but the data is not accurate. And in fact, on top of that, your state is paying school districts to do their own because they can't get the system to work. In fact, one of your state representatives said at a 2013 committee meeting, is the system working anywhere? So you've taken $42 million in funds. You are moving toward implementing it. But as of a report in January this year, in this state, the data system isn't working so well. In other states, that's not true. Will it be fixed in this state? Yes, because the feds are pushing for it. The data doesn't appear in a timely fashion, as we just talked about. Second assurance that we're going to talk about, these are the standards. Remember we said that word rigorous? The federal government held training sessions here too, talking about, this is now cradle to career education, and we're aligning instruction. So are they good? William McCallum was one of the writers of the math standards. He was one of those 29 people. He actually attended a national conference of math educators when the standards were in draft form, and they hated them. They said they were too hard in the early grades, they weren't well written, there was too much bureaucracy. And he said, well, we're in a hurry because the federal government is using Race to the Top to force the states to adopt the standards sight unseen, but not to worry because the standards won't be too high, especially in comparison with other countries. His comments were followed up in 2013 with Trevor Packer, who is the senior vice president of the College Board. Trevor works for David Coleman, who was widely considered to be the architect of the Common Core state standards. And Mr. Packer said, AP Calculus sits outside the Common Core. Calculus isn't there because Common Core asks that we slow the math progression down. In 2013, a federal think tank called the National Center for Education and the Economy wrote a document called What Does It Mean to Be College and Career Ready? And they said it means to be able to go to a first-year community college. In math, they said that meant middle school math and algebra by the end of your sophomore year in high school. Because they said since most community colleges start with Algebra 1, it's really not necessary to have Algebra 2 to go to college and take Algebra 1. And the document recognized that these were very low standards. Well, is that a good idea? You know, the U.S. Department actually does study education. In 1999, they published a document called Answers in the Toolbox. What does it mean? How do you be successful in college? And what they found is if you get to beyond Algebra 2 in math, you more than double your chances of getting a college degree. That study was part of a meta-analysis. Meta-analysis is where a researcher, instead of doing their own research, they look at all the other research and see if they can find trends. And Auburn University did one in 2004. They looked at 25 years' worth of research, and they said as secondary math rose, the likelihood of college success rose. And kids who get to calculus in high school are 28 times. I did not say 28%. I said 28 times. That's 2,800%. More likely to be not just successful, but a high achiever, regardless of their race, their socioeconomic status, the kind of high school they went to, or the major that they take, because the skills of higher math translate. But Common Core slows the math progression down. Now, does that mean every kid should go to college? No. Does that mean every kid should take calculus? No. But it does mean that we should be setting educational policies that are designed to give as many of our children as possible the chance to get to calculus because it opens doors of opportunity for them in later life. And Common Core does exactly the opposite. How is it that the Department of Education in 2014 does not know what it did know in 1999? It doesn't get any better in English. This is one of the training documents given for how to teach. It's called Close Reading of the Text, and it says you're not supposed to go outside the text. So the example was the Gettysburg Address, and it said, well, you're not supposed to ask the kids why the North and the South were fighting. You're not supposed to ask them if they've been to a funeral. You're not supposed to ask them if equality is something worth fighting for. You're only supposed to talk about the words of the Gettysburg Address, which is kind of ironic, because the Gettysburg Address says, the world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. And this turns that on its head, because they can't step outside the document. I actually started looking at texts. This is a 12th grade literature text. It's by Pearson, and I picked Pearson because Pearson is the largest developer and funder of Common Core curriculum materials. This is a 12th grade literature text. And on the very first page of the student text, the very first thing that they tell the children is that every selection available in the text is available in audio format online, and there's an audio Cliff Notes. So the first thing we tell teenagers is you don't have to read a single word in this book. Now, truth be told, if we're actually honest, when we were in high school, we probably looked at the Cliff Notes. But good teachers did activities that were designed. I actually did want you to read Shakespeare. So we did activities that made you read it. But the publisher tells the kids, you don't have to read it, and you don't even have to listen to it, because you don't even have to read the Cliff Notes. We'll give you an audio Cliff Notes. How can it be rigorous if you don't have to read it at all? The SAT test, Mr. Coleman moved from development of the Common Core standards to he is now the president of the College Board. The new SAT test is going to be College Core compliant, and according to reports, it's been dumbed down. They've eliminated the vocabulary section. They've gone back to 16 points. They've eliminated the essay. They've taken out anything that he calls complex words because you only have to read college and career-ready words, so you don't need literature. And Common Core says we're taking out literature and reading informational texts, so we don't need the obscure words that are in literature. And the new math section drops topics. Why? Well, if I slow the math progression down and they don't get to Algebra 2, but the SAT test includes Algebra 2, well, then you won't do very well. So we lift the topic out. Again, not measuring the student against the standard, measuring the standard against the student, and lowering the bar to redefine success. This is not moving achievement up. It is moving the definition of success down. Now, if our kids actually read literature, this would all sound familiar to them. This is from 1984. 1984, Winston fights with Big Brother and eventually gets caught. And in jail, O'Brien, who is his interrogator, says, don't you see that the whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we'll make thought crime literally impossible because there'll be no words in which to express it. Every concept that can ever be needed will be expressed by exactly one word, with its meaning rigidly defined and all its subsidiary meanings rubbed out and forgotten. Every year, fewer and fewer words, and the range of consciousness always a little smaller. Has it ever occurred to you, Winston, that by the year 2050, at the very latest, not a single human being will be alive who could even understand such a conversation as we're having now? Now, I always like to end with good news. This is my granddaughter. Why am I showing her to you? Well, because she's adorable. But because each of you have a face just like that in your life. That when you see that face, your heart sings. And it is the most precious thing to you. In Pennsylvania, the Department of Education came in front of our State House Education Committee to defend it and talked about how we're defining education, and they actually called the children widgets. And what they said was, well, it's like McDonald's. If you buy a hamburger at a McDonald's in one city, and then you go to another city and buy a hamburger, it's the same hamburger. So why shouldn't our schools come up with the same product? When did our kids move from the client of education to the product of education? And if they're the product, who's the client? Does anybody think what's done to the ground meat at McDonald's is done for the benefit of the hamburger? You do something to a product for a client. Common Core isn't something we're doing for our children. It's something we're doing to them. I get asked all the time, are we going to win? And I always laugh, because when I travel the country, it's women who are leading this charge. There's a reason for that. You know, it has been said that fathers will die for their children, and God love you, gentlemen. That's true. Mothers will kill. It's just that easy. And when the federal government decided to declare war on the children of America, they forgot. Every one of them has a mom and a grandmom attached, and we are never going to say, oh, it's okay, you can take them. The only question is, how long will it take? The worst thing you can do is nothing. Start with your own children. If your children are one of the ones that are refusing to go to school and vomiting and having all of these distress situations, pull them out tomorrow. We do not fight wars with children in America. If you're a teacher in the system, stay as long as you can. Close the door and protect the kids in front of you because you're their last line of defense. Make sure that you supplement so your kids can read and can write and can count. Get involved politically. You have wonderful elected folks who took the time to come today. Make sure you thank them. Make sure you stay in touch with them. If they need information, give it to them. When you have champions, support them at election time. Because trust me, your opponents are supporting their champions at election time. If your elected representative didn't come, find out why. Talk at the federal level. This is a federal initiative. The only way to actually beat it is to tell the federal government to get their sticky fingers off of our children. Go home. The federal government doesn't belong here. Kindergarten is not a place for a political agenda of some federal bureaucrat. It's just not appropriate. So we need to let that message be heard loud and clear. I had the privilege of being an advisor to the Reagan administration's Commission on the Family many years ago. And President Reagan always used to say that sometimes we forget that freedom is not passed along in the bloodstream. We have to defend it. We have to protect it. We have to teach it to our children. Because if we don't do that, we may become the generation that has to tell our kids and grandkids about a United States where people used to be free. I have no intention of becoming that generation, none whatsoever. And I came here tonight to give you the facts and to beg you to join me. Thank you. Okay, this is how I do questions, and they've agreed to accommodate me.
I was just going to say that you need everybody to pass their questions to somebody in a blue shirt so we can gather them.
They will read them in order. I do not screen the questions. They don't pre-read them and only cherry pick. You can ask me anything you want except my weight, which you can ask me, but I won't tell you. So and if it's a question that's been asked and answered, we'll just read it and say duplicate. But that way you know we didn't cherry pick the questions. You get to hear all of them. And we'll just go until we run out of time. Okay. Can homeschool children go to college? How do we prepare them for the test to get into college? Good question. Homeschool children not only can get into college, but many colleges across the country are actively seeking them because their achievement levels are higher. Because the SAT and the ACT tests have been dumbed down, at last count, there were over 1,000 colleges that are no longer using them. The SAT test actually was supposed to measure, it was called a scholastic aptitude test. It was supposed to measure how well you were able, it was a prediction of how well you were able to do in college. And before it was monkeyed with, it actually did pretty well. So now that it's pretty meaningless, over 1,000 colleges are just refusing to use it. So yes, homeschooled children can go to college. They are sought. I homeschooled my daughter, the dancer, and she was offered a $20,000 scholarship from a college she didn't even apply to because she had a homeschool diploma. And they went hunting. So they are very sought after by many colleges, and you'll just have to look for a college that works its way around the tests. How do AP courses fit into Common Core? I'll do the comment in a minute. Mr. Coleman, interestingly, Mr. Coleman actually tried to get a job teaching in the New York City school system, and they declined to hire him. So a man who couldn't get a job as a teacher is now driving education in America. Only in this country. You know, a little ironic. What are you going to say? Anyway, he moved from the architect of the Common Core standards to the presidency of the College Board. And so he is readapting AP courses to make them match the SAT in math and English, and then you hear that Common Core is just math and English, but it isn't. There's actually reading in the content areas, which is science and social studies, and so he's adapting the AP test to drive curriculum, which is where we got the AP history standards that are so bizarre. So it's a kind of a continuation of a revamping of American education, and the same gentleman is in charge. The comment was a new teacher could not explain the sophomore math curriculum to another teacher. That's probably not a comment on the teacher. It's a comment on the fact that the curriculum is really poorly constructed, confusing, and not well developed. So it's hard to explain something like that. How could this impact private schools and homeschooling parents? Are charter schools required to follow Common Core if Iowa State adopts it? Second question first. Charter schools are public schools legally, so whatever your public school system does, the charter schools by definition are required to do the same. So yes. Private schools, I don't know what maybe you, one of the reps or senators, can help me. In some states, they are specifically exempted from the requirements of Common Core, and in some states, they are specifically included in the requirements of Common Core. And I don't know what your school code says. So,
I'm a freshman.
Okay. Any of the other gentlemen or ladies? I don't know who this. I mean, I saw you stand up, but I don't remember who you all. You have a tag on. Are you one?
I don't believe they are.
Okay. Because they're private. In most states, that's true, but New Jersey is proving itself to be very hostile, so I never like to just give a blanket no. But you can check your school code. Yes, I have a hand in the back.
I have frontline knowledge that there is a parochial school that's all in. They're begging for it.
Right, but the question is, are they unfortunately, many of the private schools, parochial, church-related or secular, are doing it, but they're not mandated, they're just doing it. So I don't believe, in most states they're not mandated, and homeschoolers are not mandated. The Homeschool Legal Defense Fund is actively working to protect that.
Idaho, they're not. They're not. Private schools are not mandated.
Are not mandated. Was this lecture recorded, and if so, will a copy be available?
Yes,
So there you go.
it will be on the website.
Okay. Tips, suggestions for opting out of tests. Here in your state, I understand that's a piece of legislation that you guys are actually working on because your school codes don't specifically give parents that right. And the organization here is actually working with elected folks to make sure you have the opportunity to do that. So make sure you check with the organizing ladies to get involved with that here in Idaho. I will tell you, there's more federal court cases than we could list in this session, saying that you are, as parents, the primary educators and therefore absolutely have the right to direct the education of your own children. And that has been upheld again and again and again and again by the United States Supreme Court. So do not let a school tell you you don't have the right. You do. Push back. How will this affect private schools? We answered. What advice do you have for speaking with a legislator? My representative swears Common Core is different from Idaho Core, and Idaho Core is ours, not the feds. That's happening in a lot of states. The documents speak for themselves. So your state, and I know the ladies here have a lot of that information on their website for you, but your Race to the Top grant application, your state joined the consortium, signed the memorandum of understanding, and you have it in writing, signed by whoever the governor was here at the time. So those are things you can bring in and say, it's a contract. We did do it. And Smarter Balance is based on Common Core, so if we're not doing it, the children won't pass the test. So you kind of can put those pieces together. But for state-specific information, stay in touch with the ladies, and if they have a question and I can help them with research, you know, I'm working now in many states and I'll be happy to do that, but they're probably your best resource because they'll know more about the specifics of your state than I will. The numbers on the scores of proficiency percentages were higher 7 years ago. How can we argue that more money won't fix the current ed system? There's a number, let me do the second question first. If you look, for example, at the NAEP, which hasn't really changed in years, but federal spending has changed. However, let me give you one of the most amazing numbers. The National Center for Education Statistics has an arm called the National Assessment for Adult Literacy. I know these are lots of acronyms for you. they actually have tracked levels of adult illiteracy among high school graduates in America for many years. They have a book called 120 Years of Tracking that they went back and looked at census data and employment records. And the Adult Literacy Organization reports that by 1979, the level of adult illiteracy among American high school graduates was 0.6%. In October of 1979, the U.S. Department of Education was born. That same organization now reports that and this year, the U.S. Department of Education will spend more than $75 billion in money going to the states for education from preschool through college, not including student loans and not including competitive grants. And the level of adult illiteracy in America now is 19%. Obviously, the money isn't doing it right, is it? See, it's not about the money. It's about who's in control in the classroom. Most teachers that I know became teachers because they actually liked kids, wanted to teach, cared about kids. And instead, we turned teachers into assembly line workers. We didn't let them teach anymore. Nobody cares more about the education of that child than the parent who loves that child and the teacher who's actually met the child. And yet, increasingly, those are the people who have the least control of education. It's not about money. It's about who gets to direct the process. Education worked when education was local. This was the most amazing system in the world. Children of immigrants who didn't speak English and therefore were illiterate, with their children within one generation were doctors. That doesn't happen today. That doesn't happen today. So it's not about the money. It's about who's in charge. And increasingly, federal bureaucrats are in charge. Well, we all know how well that works, right? Why are parents choosing to refuse the test? The test is not valid. It is the SBAC, the Smarter Balance Test. The test is not valid. It is not reliable. It can have huge impacts on the future of your child, often inappropriately. So if my kids were still in school, I'd be refusing the test as well, because it goes on your record, and you have no way of knowing if that score is actually representative of how well your child did. And it isn't even a big, huge conspiracy. When I was a kid, I have 3 sisters, and we went to a school that used to give exams in January and then in June. A lot of schools did that then. When one of my sisters was 7, she did well, and then she got to the January exams and she flunked them all. And so the principal called my mother and said, I just don't know what happened. You'll have to come in. We're going to have to talk about this. I don't know what happened. So they made an appointment for like 2 days later. The day in the middle, my mother called laughing and said, never mind, she broke out in the measles last night. She was sick. Because, you're sick with the measles before the rash came out. Now nobody gets the measles because we all get vaccinated, but I'm old, so. In any given testing population, about 10% of the kids have some factor that changes their achievement. They're sick and don't know it, or didn't know to tell you. Their dog died last night. They didn't get a good night's sleep. There was a fire up the street, and they were up watching the fire engine. There is a big upheaval in their family. That all affects their ability to take that test. But nobody knows which children they are. We do know as the socioeconomic status of the child goes down, the percentage of children for whom those extra factors make a difference go up. I was in New York, and a teacher in one of the poorest districts said, you gave this test to my kids, and one of them watched her mother get shot on the front porch of her home in a drive-by shooting. And you want her to take a test and think it's going to mean anything? Those tests are not valid. And the thing is, educational researchers have always known that. They are not valid measurements of an individual child's performance because you don't know too much about the situation. But these tests can affect teacher evaluation. It can affect your child graduating or being promoted. Don't let that be on your child's record. You want what happens in that district with teachers who know them, that on all of the grades. And if the teacher doesn't do a good job, then deal with that at the local level. Not with some big standardized test that may tie your child to a number that follows them forever and doesn't mean anything. How can youth help stop Common Core? That's a really good question. You know, children, in many states, they're actually talking to elected representatives. This is what happened in the classroom. Here's how I felt about it. You hear from bureaucrats, well, I'm the one experiencing it, with their moms right beside them or their dads right beside them. Children can write letters. Children can attend things with you. It's really good for them to see parents involved in civic activities and be part of the process. You can speak out in classes if you're old enough and feel comfortable with it. But in the end, this is an adult battle. God bless all the children who want to step up to the plate. But it's not our children's job to protect themselves. It's our job to protect them. That's why we call them children. What can parents, children do by told by school officials that they have to take the test? The first thing I would do is ask for the legislation that says that. Where's the law, federal or state, that says it? The law says that they have to administer the test. It doesn't say you have to take it. It says they have to administer it. The reason the push is so hard is that if they don't, and the federal regs actually say the school has to have 95% participation, because if there's not 95% participation, it invalidates the data. So if more than 5% opt out, the data becomes invalid. But in many states, parents, in New York, over 60,000 parents last year opted out of the test. And this year they're aiming at 250,000 to refuse the test. And what the district did when parents started getting together to do it was they just declared that child ineligible. There's actually an organization, and I can't think of the name of it, but I'll get it to you, to put a link on your website, that has procedures that you can use, things that you can say to, in some states you have to call it refuse the test, in some states you can opt out, and I'm not sure what your state codes say. So, but you do have a right to do it, and I would exercise that right, and try to get other parents to join you so you're not the only one. Yes?
I was actually called by my elementary school, and they said, your child will not be granted a certificate of diploma in high school, and he's in 3rd grade. He will not graduate because you're opting out of the test.
And your response is, I want to see the state law that says that. And your next phone call is to your state representatives to say, this is what I've been told. I either want to see the state law that says that, or I want you to call them and say, I'm the representative, and I don't remember passing legislation to that effect, so, State representatives are very good advocates. You know, they pass legislation, and I'm sure they do a good job, but I'm sure they'll all tell you, they do a lot of constituent service. So being your advocate in those kind of situations is certainly something you can ask for. Can you address the data gathering via SRI International promoting, it's promoting grit, tenacity, and perseverance, non-cognitive factors, attributes, dispositions, social skills, attitudes, interpersonal resources independent of intellectual ability. The specific document promoting grit, tenacity, and perseverance was a draft document that appeared on the Department of Education website for a while, but it did say draft on it in big red letters. So instead of talking about a document that only ever said draft, let me give you some actual history. Pennsylvania was one of the incubator states in testing. We have been doing this testing in Pennsylvania all the way back in the late 70s, early 80s. And the original test was called the EQA, the Educational Quality Assessment. And it surfaced because an 8th grade boy came home and said to his mom, I took a really weird test today, and when he listed the questions, she called the school and said he made that up. I want to see the test. And they said, you're not allowed. And she said, no, I'm the mommy. Yes, I am. No, you're not. She filed a federal lawsuit. She won. And Pennsylvania had entered a consent agreement saying they wouldn't do it anymore. What were they doing? The Educational Quality Assessment had in 10 different units, I believe. One unit was called citizenship, which a reasonable person seeing citizenship would think it would be saying who's the president and how long was he the president and how many people are on the Supreme Court. It tested thresholds of behavior change. The kids were presented this example given in the document was there was a group called the Midnight Marauders who went out and did, like vandalism and graffiti. I would join the group if, and then there were a list of conditions. You couldn't say you wouldn't join the group. You had to say under what condition you would join it. It was testing for what the document called thresholds of behavior change. It tested for locus of control. Are you internally controlled or are you open to peer pressure? It tested for adaptability to change without protest. These are all quotes. The document actually said they tested for this. The children took the test, and the test became the basis for validated studies by the U.S. Department of Education that then came back to the states called Resources for Curriculum Improvement, so that the children would do better on the EQA, meaning they would meet the state desired response for locus of control and adaptability to change without protest and thresholds for behavior change. When this mother, her name was Anita Hogue, surfaced it, Pennsylvania had to enter into a consent agreement with the U.S. Department of Education saying they wouldn't do it anymore. They didn't do the EQA anymore. They didn't stop testing. In the 1990s, when Goals 2000 was being debated, and it was called outcome-based education, I was one of the national leaders, and so I live in Pennsylvania, and I made them show me the tests. And I'm sitting in the room with the Undersecretary of Education, and I'm reading these tests, and it's a reading test. And it said, I found a story about a kid who found a wallet, and there was money in the wallet, and the whole story was about what did the little one do with the money. Then you get to the questions. First question, what did the child find? That's literal comprehension, found a wallet. Second question, if you, in other words, the paper actually said you, meaning it's talking to the child taking the test. If you found a wallet with money in it, would you keep it? And I turned the paper around to the undersecretary and said, do you read better if you say yes? Or do you read better if you say no? Or did you just test honesty on a computerized assessment with a child's name on it? They did assess honesty. So we do know that they have been doing this and are looking to, because they've done it in the past, and we are now seeing that surface. I didn't talk about the new GED test because I didn't have enough time tonight, but the new GED test is Common Core compliant. The kids get a writing prompt, and then they're supposed to, source text and then a writing prompt, and they're graded on the complexity of their answer. The source text is about foreign aid, and it talks about how levels of foreign aid to countries like Afghanistan probably weren't high enough, which led to the poor Afghanis who flew planes into the World Trade Center on 9/11. They weren't Afghanis, and they weren't poor. They were Saudis and one Egyptian. But the children reading that, when kids read in a test-taking situation, there's no screen to the information because you're trying to answer the question. So they're not evaluating what they're being told. They're just drinking it in. So that was propaganda. In Iowa, there was a writing assessment. It was a flu shot, and there would be the side effects, this many people would be fatal. And the child was supposed to design a research situation using this flu shot to experiment to bring the flu shot with acceptable levels of casualties, et cetera. So if a child said, I don't think it's right to experiment on people, their response won't be complicated enough. So they'll get a lower score. Had nothing to do with the writing ability. They made a moral statement. But if you're graded on the complexity of your response and you say it's not right to experiment on people, that's not very complex, is it? But nobody knew what they were doing was testing how willing was the child to experiment on people. So you don't need to look at a draft document. There are real assessments happening out there. Now, when they're paper and pencil, like the EQA, they're a lot easier to get your fingers on. When they're in a computer adaptive testing situation, it's going to be a lot harder for us to figure out what they're doing. What are the consequences of refusing the tests? In New York, None. In New Jersey, they tried to force it, and parents went and found all the court cases, and what New Jersey is doing is saying that if you refuse the test, your child is ineligible. So there's a lot of bullying going on right now in some quarters, like you are shared with us. Push back. This is your right. It's been affirmed by the Supreme Court over and over again, and here in Idaho, you have legislation that will affirm it, so work with these folks and your legislators to make sure that happens. Are schools and teachers allowed to see the tests and the test results? The teachers are not allowed to see the tests because they say it would be cheating. The only results you get back are proficient or not proficient. In fact, in New York, 530 principals actually wrote a letter that went to papers all over the state saying, since all we know is Johnny was proficient, we don't know what proficient means, we don't know questions he got right or wrong, we can't act on this information, so it's essentially meaningless. And that's part of the problem, that there's no actionable information. So no, they can't see the tests, and the results that they get are not question by question. The results that they get are proficient or not proficient. And you have to go digging to get cut scores. Usually when I'm in states, people look at me like, wow, how did you find that? Well, first of all, I know what a cut score is, so I know where to look. But most people don't even know that those exist and don't know how to find them. So it's a process, but the teachers are given very little information that's actually would be valuable to them or the children. And I'm out of questions, so thank you very much and have a lovely evening.